Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to Wesley's Own Words, my special podcast and class looking at Wesley's original writings that have been modernized. And today we're going to be continuing looking at one of Wesley's sermons, The Almost Christian. I remember this is one of early John Wesley, so this is very direct, matter of fact. Wesley, he does kind of soften in his older years, for sure. But this was an early sermon and one that was very popular and really kind of set a stage and a standard for what it is that Methodists would be. So hopefully you've heard the last episode, which was the first one. What did we look at? I think the first 5 or 6 paragraphs, something like that. First 8 paragraphs, where he talked about the outward appearance of godliness as part of it. And living a outward life and having basic morality, basic ethical behavior. We talked about that. And then he gets on to the third thing this week. The third thing that makes you an almost Christian, which he calls sincerity. And that was kind of the cliffhanger we left it off last week with. Just checking my cameras here. Oh, looking pretty good. Anyway, that's kind of where we left it off last week. The idea of sincerity. So we're going to dive right into that and what he means. I'm going to be reading from my published version of these translations available on Amazon, should you want to look it up. Awakened Words, as a search on Amazon will bring it up. But let's continue on with what Wesley's talking about. He says, by sincerity, I mean a genuine internal religious motivation that drives these outward actions. Without this, we don't even possess the basic pagan integrity, not even enough to satisfy the pagan Epicurean poet. Even that miserable person in his more rational moments could attest that. And then he has some Latin that I'm not going to say, but the translation of the Latin is, good people avoid sin from the love of virtue. Wicked men avoid sin from the fear of punishment. All right. I debated when I did these translations about that word pagan. What we have to understand first and foremost, and this was kind of hang up in the class that where I taught this, is that doesn't mean kind of the modern incarnation of pagan, Wiccan, all of that you might see today. There's been a new kind of reclaiming of that label and that name as part of what is really a really new religious movement. He doesn't mean that. When he says pagan, he means he's using it in the same way that the scripture uses Gentile to mean everybody not Jewish. So what he means by pagan is he means anything that is any body or any piece of work that is being written from a non-strictly Christian viewpoint. So the writings of Plato and Aristotle, which obviously predate Jesus, would be quote unquote pagan. And there's a lot of, so basically anything that is not explicitly overtly Christian gets lumped into the category of quote unquote pagan. So, the other word that could be used there and in future translations I might use is secular. That is, pagan is a loaded word, I think, for us today in a way that it really wouldn't have been as loaded in Wesley's day. So really, we would use the word secular today to mean something similar. But he's basically saying that even these folks, may have an internal motivation, right? And their internal motivation is love of virtue, right? That was in kind of Gentile, strictly philosophical sense of things, absent kind of any religious context. He is saying good people avoid sin from the love of virtue, right? So there's a love for being virtuous. There's a love for doing the right thing. There's a love for goodness and being good. And that is what motivates you to do and be and put good into the world. And he says, even they will attest to that versus the wicked man who avoids sin out of fear of punishment, right? I'm not doing it wrong because I don't want to go to jail, right? And I don't think a lot of us live that way. I don't actually spend a lot of time worrying about going to jail, even though I've been watching a lot of legal dramas. I did think the other day that, man, it would really stink to do that. I really don't ever want that to be a part of my life. But it's not like a day-to-day motivation. Like avoiding sin, avoiding punishment, avoiding, things like that is not something that I necessarily think about. Perhaps avoiding negative consequences, like when I decide, do I really want to eat that, but I know it's going to make me feel terrible. I may say, I'm not going to do that simply to try to avoid feeling bad afterwards. That is probably a little bit more in line of what he's saying here. And that is a motivation. But the dominant motivation, hopefully, is that we appreciate good people. We appreciate goodness, and we want to put goodness out in the world. I mean, like receiving goodness. And he says, even the secular, philosopher will recognize that. So he says, so if anyone avoids doing wrong only to escape punishment, you won't. Okay, and then there's a parenthetical. So he says, so if someone avoids doing wrong only to escape punishment, parentheses, and he's quoting something here, you won't feed the crows on a cross, meaning you won't be hanged. That, as the pagan would say, is its own reward. Even he wouldn't consider someone like that a good pagan. Therefore, if anyone motivated by fear of punishment, loss of friends, financial setbacks, or damaged reputation not only refrains from evil, but does much good and diligently uses all of the means of grace, we still shouldn't accurately call that person even almost a Christian. Without a better motivation in their heart, they are simply a complete hypocrite. Oh my gosh, John, you're so mean. Well, not really mean, but he's a bit stark, as he was wont to be. So he's kind of what we just talked about. He's saying if you're only avoiding punishment, then that's not a good enough reason. And even if that isn't your reason, you just want to do good, even that alone isn't a good enough reason. Now, what I find really funny about this is that he will in other places, I believe in the general rules, when he talks about who's a Methodist and everybody, he talks about, people who are trying to flee the wrath to come. And to me, that sounds like avoiding punishment. And he lifts that up as kind of the minimum level of motivation for someone to be interested, not only in what it is to be a Methodist and Methodism, but really to be involved in religion and the Christian faith altogether. That is I've always thought that was a kind of a weird phrasing for him, because he doesn't talk a lot about wrath outside of that, and he's clearly motivated by doing no harm, doing good, being connected with God, all these other things, and reading this helps us understand that when he says things like that, when he says in the general rules, the only requirement is to want to flee the wrath to come. This kind of tells us that for him, that is like the basest, most simplest motivation for doing anything, right? Simply wanting to avoid the bad, wanting to avoid punishment, wanting to avoid negative consequences, if that is your motivation, like that is literally as basic as it gets as a motivation. And so when he says flee the wrath to come in other places, what I take him to mean is he's saying even people with the most simplest, basic, most, fundamental of motivations for doing anything in life, because, really, even in that flee the wrath to come, wrath from who, right? Like, where are these consequences coming from? It doesn't specifically say from God. It's like, okay, you just want to, avoid, the negatives of life. And he's like, well, that's that is the most simplest, basic thing. So I think when he says that in other places, what he's basically saying is that the threshold for being a part of this thing is really low. Right? Like the most basic of basic things. Like even you can train animals to avoid negative things. I was in a zoo once in India. Crazy place to be. And there was literally an elephant standing in this area that was kept in by a single wire that was like 3 feet off the ground, and it was just tall enough that the elephant, I think it's a he, couldn't step over it on his own, and he wouldn't be able to get through it without running into it. And apparently when the elephant first arrived, they had electrified that wire. And so he learned very quickly, the elephant did, that, don't cross that wire, it hurts. They didn't even electrify the wire anymore because the elephant was, just fine with, there were still signs up warning it was electrified, but you could kind of see off to the side it wasn't actually plugged in to anything. But that's all the elephant needed. It's like, I'm like, I will literally stay in this small area because, to avoid being hurt, by that wire over there. And, we have modern versions of these, like with the fenceless dog thing where you put the sensors in your yard and the dog, puts the little, collar on the dog. And if it passes the line, then it gets shocked. And it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want this. So even animals can learn behavior as a way of avoiding pain. And if that is our motivation, and let's not even necessarily say it's even necessarily a bad motivation per se, it's just the most basic one stitched into us, right? We eventually learn that the stove is hot and not to touch it. So, but that's not enough, right? That motivation is not enough. But also the simple love of doing good, again, absent and really nothing wrong with wanting to do good, but wanting to do good absent basically God, absent, that desire to love God and love neighbor, which is what is coming up, spoiler, though not this week. That's what it, that's still not good enough. All right. So he talks about sincerity, right? So be sincere in our motivations, having sincere motivations. And I don't think, and honestly, avoiding pain is not a insincere motivation. It's just an inadequate one. Okay, so he continues. Therefore, sincerity is absolutely essential to being almost a Christian. This means a genuine intention to serve God and a heartfelt desire to do God's will. It necessarily implies a sincere aim to please God in everything. Oh, so God's getting in here. In all conversations, actions, and decisions. If someone is almost a Christian, this intention permeates their entire life. That's the underlying motivation for doing good, avoiding evil, and participating in religious practices. So once we step out of the kind of quote-unquote secular, pagan, however you want to think about it, philosophical world that, good is good because it's good and we should do good because it's good, God comes into it now, and now we're like, okay, so being almost Christian means a genuine intention to serve God, right? And, to do what God wills, right? Which sounds great. Like, I would love it. Like, if I had a church full of people who were desired nothing, but God's love and to do God's will. I think that'd be phenomenal. And so the fact that we're still, under the Christian bar and still into the world of almost Christian as far as he's concerned, you're like, oh my gosh, John. But, so that's what he's saying. He's saying everything has to, be about that. The parameter, predates their life. Everything we do is about doing good. When we avoid evil, and we participate in religious practices, it's from a heartfelt desire, to serve God and do God's will. Right? So, God has his will and desire for everybody's life, and we want to find out what that is, and we want to do it because it's the right, good thing to do. This is required. This is something we should do, and we should try to do. But that bar feels really high because there are plenty of times, even in my life, where I'm fairly sure I'm not, doing what I need to do, to serve God. But then what? Like, okay, then what are we supposed to do? So at 11, he finally says, ask the question that everybody be asking at this point. Now, again, remember, this is a sermon. And so, like, reading these first 10 paragraphs would have taken, like, a handful of minutes. It wouldn't have taken very long if you were just hearing this as a sermon and we weren't stopping to do, you're not going to have multiple episodes, or he's not stopping to do commentary like we're doing on this podcast and all of that. But he's building and building and building and building, and he starts kind of this like, okay, like I get it around basic morality, like, all right, well, I can get with that. It's not enough because, we're more than just moral, and then outward appearances. And now we get to this idea of sincerity, and he's building and building and building. But if you were in the audience, you would have to be thinking, this bar is already getting way higher than I think I can clear, as far as what the standards is. And if there is going to be any more, then I don't even know why I'm sitting here listening to it. So you can see the master of the rhetorical argument that John Wesley is, and I love him for it. He's building up this case like, okay. And then so finally at 11, he says, but you may ask, and trust me, they're asking, is it possible for someone to go this far and still only be almost a Christian? What more could being a completely Christian involve? I answer, first, I know it's possible to go this far and yet not to be a full Christian, not just from the Bible, but from my personal experience. So John's going to go on in a second in this next paragraph and be a bit self-revelatory in a way that people in his position at the time really weren't. Pastors were, there's a pretty strong class system in England at the time John Wesley is, still is kind of today. Pastors and clergy were part of that system, but it was interesting because it was one of the few paths that people from, kind of lower classes could get, could find themselves elevated a little bit. Because it was one of the few ways you could raise your class and your status by your vocation. That really wasn't something that was available outside of at this time there's merchants and merchant ships and things like that. So, merchant captains and things like that could also do it. But it wasn't as many opportunities as there is today, to kind of bootstrap yourself into a higher class in society. Clergy was one. And so people would be very diligent about preserving their reputations. So it was uncommon at the time for, clergy to admit to, normal human struggles. They wanted to project an air of, having it together and this air of being, a good, respectable person. So it would not be common for pastors, especially like the sermons and stuff, to speak about times when they fell short or to in any way, look vulnerable to those around them. So when he says, I know it is possible to go this far and yet not to be a full Christian, but for my own personal experience, right? I mean, he's basically admitting there was a time when he would have thought of, he realized he himself was only almost a Christian. And this has a very humanizing sense of it, right? I mean, that's the benefit and why clergy do it, why it might choose to be vulnerable and share in this way, is it gives you, it humanizes you in a way that otherwise, maybe you wouldn't have for folks. So he goes on to paragraph 12. Friends, I speak to you with great candor. Forgive me this wrong if I openly share my own past failings for your benefit and for the sake of the gospel. Allow me to speak freely about myself as if I were talking about someone else. I'm willing to humble myself so that you may be uplifted and become even more insignificant for the glory of my Lord. So he's basically saying, I'm going to humble myself in front of you in a way that they would not be used to clergy doing, in order for their, edification. And he's basically stating right out front that this is what he is doing. And then he goes on, and this is actually, we're going to finish up today, paragraph 13. For years I went this far, as many here can attest. I diligently avoided evil and strived to maintain a clear conscience, making the most of my time and seizing every opportunity to do good to everyone. And yes, this would have been his reputation at the time. I constantly and carefully engaged in all public and private religious practices, striving for consistent seriousness in my conduct at all times and in all places. And God as my witness, I did all this sincerely with a genuine intention to serve God, a heartfelt desire to do God's will in everything, to please God who called me to fight the good fight and to take hold of eternal life. Yet my own conscience, guided by the Holy Spirit, testifies that during all that time, I was only almost a Christian. All right, Methodism are called Methodists because we had a method, and originally they made fun of us by calling us Methodists, and the thing they were making fun of was exactly what Wesley was just talking about, was how diligently and seriously and methodically Wesley and his brother and the early followers went about practicing their faith. They did it much more seriously and much more methodically and with much more intentionality of following God and God's will than really was common at the time, or really even ever seen at the time. And because they felt that's what they were called to do. And so Wesley is right. Like that is what he was known for. It's what Methodists were known for. It's why we have the name that we have. It's what, made Wesley distinct and stand out was, how serious he was about going and doing and trying and everything he could do to please God. I mean, he really felt like this, he really obviously felt an insecurity about himself and his faith, and thought he could overcome that insecurity by doing everything he possibly could at all times that he could, and then also encouraging others to do the same. And again, we would sit here and go, that all sounds great. Why would you not want that? Why would you, what's the problem here? And he will go on and, in our next session to describe, the alternative, but that's what's lumping him in this almost a Christian category, is, he was striving for not necessarily a bad thing, because pleasing God certainly and following God's will is never a bad thing, but he was striving for, something else, for, not for the complete thing, as we might, not the complete experience of God, right, and not the complete relationship with God that God wants, right, because it was still all about outwardness, and really the problem is it's all about outwardness. It's all about doing and being, and not about what it really is supposed to be about, which of course is loving God and loving neighbor, which again is where this is going, FYI. So, Wesley's doing this thing. I don't know that people even at the time would have thought this was as shocking as maybe he thought it was. You can hear in that sentence when he's talking about it, that I don't know that I think from the journals at the time that Wesley's behind everything, he's not completely comfortable with this. He's not completely comfortable with the amount of self-revelation he's finding he has to do. He's barely comfortable with the idea, of preaching out into the streets and the byways and the marketplaces and all that. Remember, he called that being vile, V-I-L-E, being more vile is to be out there and, acting in this ways. So he's already got like some hangups around that he's, this is 1841, I think. So he's kind of barely into, he's only been doing it for a few years, I think, at this point. So there's probably still a level of discomfort with even being in the world that way. And so not only is he out there doing it this way, but he's also like, humbling himself and basically saying, I'm not perfect either. I am basing everything I've just shared with you. He's basically saying everything I just shared with you, I know because I lived it and I experienced it. And I can tell you that even though I was doing all of these things to a level, Wesley was practicing his faith to an extreme that most everybody in that audience that would have heard him, nobody was even getting close to, right? And so when he says, I do this from experience, that's what he means. And yeah, so then we gotta, then realizes, but then he has a moment, really a series of moments where he realizes that that's not quite right. Now, what's interesting is he will go on, right? If Methodism followed forward, if you've read some of the other things we've done or whatever, you see that Wesley still wants us to, try to please God and follow God's will in our lives. Like he wants that. Like that is still part and parcel of the process. It's just not, it's not adequate on its own. Right. So, there will be a bit of a twist coming and a bit of a redirection coming, but that does not mean that we, don't also have to act with sincerity. It's just, again, he calls this rather brilliantly almost a Christian, because he's basically saying it's part but not adequate on its own. So, yeah. All right, so this is Wesley's The Almost Christian here on Wesley's Own Words. Again, the published version of the writings that we're doing for this, that we've done in all this podcast, is available on Amazon if you want to check that out. Please share this with your friends. I know I say that every time, but it does help. And so next time, I don't know if we'll quite finish. We might finish up this sermon next time, or maybe make 2 more times. I don't know. I know this episode's dropping late. I apologize. I was on vacation last week, for spring break, visiting some family down in Albuquerque. So that's why this one's a little bit late. But I appreciate your grace on that. All right. Well, thank you all. Hold on. I got to cue the music. Thank you all for joining. Don't forget to check us out, johnstown.church. Wesley's Own Words. Share, like, subscribe, all of the things. And until I see you again, have a blessed day.